that I should be recording this event. Now we are recording today's event, so for posterity, welcome to the Institute of International Studies. It's my great pleasure to host you all this afternoon. Some quick guidelines. We're recording, so be aware that we're recording today's event. The format for today is going to go a little bit like this. Patrick is going to speak about his new book project for 20-25 minutes, after which we will sort of transition to an open discussion, which I will lead and moderate as appropriate. Since this is, like so many of our events today, a hybrid event, a few words about the hybrid format might be in order. In-person participants are, of course, welcome to engage, to pose questions via the conventional manner. Simply indicate by raising a hand if you would like to pose a question, and you will be very welcome to do so. Zoom participants, probably it is easiest for you to pose questions via the chat function, and then I, as moderator, can compile your questions into some kind of logical sequence. So in other words, if you want to post a wholly logical, illogical, out of sequence question, it would be best to come here and do so in person. With all that out of the way, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's very special guest, Patrick Cohrs, who is Professor of International History at the University of Florence. It is a real pleasure to be able to introduce Patrick, whose new book really does confirm his standing as a master of one of the oldest and grandest historiographical traditions of all, that of international, or as we sometimes still dare to call it, diplomatic history. Patrick himself lays out in his book's introduction what makes international history such a challenging and rewarding field in which to practice. As he himself describes it in the introduction to his new book, The New Atlantic Order, the international historian needs to be attentive simultaneously to various levels, or as Ken Waltz might have called them, frames of analysis. These include the international system, a system that is always changing, not the eternal anarchy of Waltzian myth. To the level of high international politics, which involve the relationships among international actors, most often nation states. Domestic politics, which occur within all of the protagonist states, even those that are not democracies, and which usually defy easy generalization. And finally, the realm of transnational politics, which occur across the boundaries of states and become only more consequential with the historical advance of globalization. For the historian, what results from the interplay of these levels of analysis is a complex, simultaneous equation, the solution of which requires extraordinary analytical dexterity and remarkable empirical range. Fortunately, these are qualities that Patrick possesses in abundance and skills that he has honed in an academic career that has taken him to some of the world's finest universities. Patrick earned his doctorate at Oxford University, where he later served as Alistair Horn Fellow at St. Anthony's College. In between these postings at Oxford, he held fellowships at Harvard University, where he was associated with both the Center for European Studies and the John F. Kennedy School of Government, now, of course, the Harvard Kennedy School. Patrick subsequently taught at Yale University, where he held a dual appointment in the history department and the Macmillan Center.
Oh, yes, at the
Macmillan
Center, later Jackson Institute
of International Relations. After his stint at Yale, he returned to Europe, where he joined the faculty of the University of Florence, of which he is today a member. Patrick is a historian with an extraordinary appetite for writing big books on weighty and significant topics. His first book, The Unfinished Peace, explores Anglo-American contributions to the stabilization of European international politics in the decade and a half after the First World War. His second book, The New Atlantic Order, on which Patrick will speak today, takes an even broader historical view. It explores how a framework for international order emerged from the crucible of late 19th century high imperialism and the catastrophe of the First World War. Weighing in at over 1,000 pages, and here is the physical artifact, it is a big book. Even more impressive, I would suggest, it is just the first in an envisioned two-book series that will explore the transformation of the Atlantic International Order, as Patrick calls it, conceives it, over the long arc of the 20th century. We are truly fortunate that Patrick has been able to make time to visit with us at Berkeley today and look forward to what will surely be an enlightening discussion of the historical origins and evolution of an international order that is today in a state of appreciable disarray. Patrick, over to you.
Daniel, thank you so much for these very generous and comprehensive remarks, which pose two challenges to me. A, you already, I think, summarized my book admirably, so what am I going to say? And secondly, you raised massive expectations. So let me start there. I'm on a bit of a book tour that took me first to the East Coast and now towards the high point on the West Coast. And when I arrived, I began to realize immediately at John F. Kennedy Airport that the stakes in the United States had been raised, because I saw that for a truly influential international story nowadays, you have to be able to explain everything. Yeah, and this later I talked to someone at Columbia University who made this claim. So I want to do something that one of the protagonists of this book, Woodrow Wilson, was not so excelling at, namely to manage expectations. And so I hate to disappoint you right at the start. I cannot explain everything, but what I will try to do is to give you a sense of the kind of, what has led me to write this book, why it became so long, but why it is also a dramatic and tightly written book. And I cut more than 80,000 words, so to make it more manageable. Now, the point here is, I do think that, so we are in a kind of transition time, a time of fundamental change. It's not a moment, it's a period of sort of tectonic change. If we look at what's happening in Ukraine, but also if we look at what is happening to the international order more generally. I posit, and this is something I try to explore in this book, that we are in something that we might call the end of the long 20th century. And I hope by the end of my remarks, you will have a sense of what I mean by that. This book takes us back to the origins of the long 20th century, which I situate in the middle of the chronological 19th century, and I'll explain why. So in my view, this century dawned when the 19th century international system, that of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, still very Eurocentric, anchored in a European concert, disintegrated under pressures both from without and within. On the one hand, the idea that you had to have more democratically legitimated forms of government and modern states. On the other hand, Daniel has already referred to this, the pressures that came from what I call a globalization, not just of economic and other forms of exchange in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, but also of power politics and the competition in the end on a global scale in the age of so-called high imperialism. And this book sort of makes the point in its first part that one thing that did not change in a very constructive way in this period is the international system, the ways that actors at the level of states, but also in the transnational realm, had to deal with the immense challenges and dynamics that resulted from this almost unlimited competition. I call this the involution, the retrograde development of international politics, from concerted attempts to at least govern Europe, a kind of European system, towards a constellation that in the end, in the summer of 1914, sees not a system that can deal with a massive crisis, such as that provoked by the assassination and a regional conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and the developments after the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, but actually had no ways of preventing the escalation of this crisis into the greatest war that humanity had seen up to that point. So this is one of the questions. So why did this occur? This is the first part of the book. But then the main sort of intervention has to do with trying to suggest that we need to try to understand both the impact of the First World War and of peacemaking and reordering efforts in its aftermath in a new light, in a more comprehensive way. We have to get away from the idea that we need to look at this moment of 1919 or the moment of the First World War or the moment that Aris Manila so influentially is called the Wilsonian moment. What we should do, and this is what the book tries to do, is to place this in a broader context, because we need to understand both the origins of this war in a different way, the impact it had, and then the consequences of what could and could not be done in its aftermath. So George F. Kennan famously said, the First World War was the original catastrophe of the 20th century, or we might say the short 20th century. In my view, it is a kind of a cataclysmic, but also a catalyzing catastrophe that comes at a turning point of the long 20th century. So between the system that had existed, or disorder that existed before 1914, so where we have civilizational Darwinism, unlimited competition, balance of power politics, competing alliances, and then the attempts, first in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, and then in the 1920s, and successively after the Great Depression and after the Second World War on different terms, to construct what I call the first attempt at a modern international system. So a modern international system that, in terms of rhetoric, its reach, its ideas, supposedly was very universal and global, but that at the core, and this is why the book is called The New Atlantic Order, in my interpretation, revolved around the attempt to construct, for the first time in history, a new Atlantic order, a process dominated by European actors and American actors that, of course, had massive implications on a global scale, on East Asia, on all regions of the world, including the Western Hemisphere and Latin America, but that at the very core, and this also is what really dominated the Paris Peace Conference, was sort of the attempt of actors that had never done this before to try to work out common understanding, ground rules, and solutions to the challenges that the Great War had created. Among them, for example, the treatment of the vanquished. The German Empire sort of on its way to a very crisis-prone but remarkable Weimar Republic, the question of the reorganization of Eastern and Central Europe with the demise of the Eastern empires, the question of what to do with Bolshevik Russia, or potentially Bolshevik Russia, at the time when you still had a Russian civil war, and when Lenin and other Bolshevik actors were saying, this is not a time for reforms or American prescriptions, but a time for Bolshevik revolutionary change. Yet, my model of looking at this is not influenced by what I consider a very dominant set of paradigms that we see nowadays, namely that of almost a kind of ever-extending Cold War. So obviously this book engages with some of the older sort of reigning paradigms, which we might associate with Eric Hobsbawm's very influential and interesting, but not very archivally based works on both the 19th century and the long 19th century, from the Euro-Atlantic revolutions, the French-American revolutions, towards the First World War on the one hand, work that later, of course, has been done on a completely different level by Jürgen Osterhammel's magisterial, the transformation of the world. That is a world still at the end of which you have a kind of world order or disorder dominated by imperial power states of different kinds. So that's the one very important sort of setting we need to discuss. Then the other one I mentioned earlier, it's the Cold War. So the idea that from 1916-17 onwards, and then in different iterations, we have the newly rising basic competition between the Bolshevik communist alternative to come out of this crisis and the liberal American capitalist counter-alternative. So Wilson versus Lenin. Arno Mayer did very important work on this, and many have followed. And the most sophisticated and most interesting contemporary sort of work on this has clearly been done by Arnie Westad, who is now trying to show how some of these patterns of conflict could take us back into the 19th century. So my argument is that both of these sort of prisms through which we see the transformation of the modern international order come from generations of scholars who have been very shaped by the Cold War. And I find, what this book tries to suggest is that if you take a more comprehensive view and not one sort of looking backwards through the prism of what happened after 1945, but forwards, so in terms of how do we explain the transformation of the international order from the 1860s, when my long 20th century starts, towards its sort of culmination in some way. This is the next book I'm writing. It's called the Pax Atlantica, after the Second World War, yeah, so between the 1945 and the 1960s, I find, and that's why I've been writing this book, we can make more sense of this if we talk of a long 20th century, yeah, so which starts with the massive crisis that does not, is not ignited in 1914, but it starts when the actors of the late chronological 19th century find ever fewer ways to deal with their conflicts and the different hierarchies that they're looking at in peaceful, constructive ways. And what happens after the catastrophe of the First World War, when you have, so a new range of actors trying to suggest that something fundamental had to change for the world to be ever peaceful again. So my attempt, and Daniel alluded to this at the beginning, is to suggest that we should try to avoid what has been quite, in my view, crippling, to put it provocatively, in today's academic world, namely the compartmentalization of history. So we have some people working in a more old-fashioned way on international diplomatic history, state relations, others looking at the international economy, others yet at transnational actors, those, for example, that after 1914 joined League of Nations promotion associations or the Women's Peace Party and said, we need to have a broader engagement to avoid a kind of peace where certain state leaders do backroom deals and secret arrangements. We need to have this out in the open diplomacy and so on. I think that a lot of valuable work has been done here, and this has also been globalized. So we have to, of course, look beyond Europe, look beyond the transatlantic sphere, and this book is embedded in a global context. But as I try to suggest, in a very banal way, I would say, all these actors inhabited the same world. And so if we want to understand how they all interacted and interrelated and why in 1918, 1919, especially a lot of the aspirations and hopes of non-governmental actors who thought that something more fundamental could occur, a more sustainable and sustained and powerful League of Nations could be founded, why their expectations were so violently disappointed. We have to reanalyze and reassess the peacemaking and reordering process after the First World War in a much more comprehensive way. That avoids two things. On the one hand, the old style, I call it blame game history. So a lot is at stake here. The nature and quality of this peacemaking process in older interpretations determines who is responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War, who's responsible for all the kinds of crises that occur after 1919. So a lot is at stake, and so a lot of there's a lot of politicized writing on the Paris Peace Conference from 1919 onwards. So it starts with John Maynard Keynes and others, the economic consequences of the peace, then defenses of this peace, and so on. So I'm suggesting that we can take a systemic analytical approach that avoids this kind of, so saying that, oh, the peace should have been more enforced, it's a French fault, it's the British fault, it's the US fault. I'm trying to suggest that all of these actors faced an unprecedentedly complex situation, but they did so on different levels. So some were in a role of being the leaders of more or less, although very limited, democratic states, thinking of the United States, Britain, France, who also had won this war. So they had to find common ground, even to get towards something like a peace architecture. At the same time, they had to do this in an environment that the war had transformed. You mentioned this. So all the kinds of interdependencies between what happened at the international level, in the domestic spheres, mobilized by years of warfare, ideological conflict, sort of unreasonable demands, high expectations of conquest or peace, and the newly important transnational connections, so in which different, for example, domestic environments interacted with one another. This is not a compartmentalized world. We have to understand all of them, then to see what was possible and what was not possible in 1919. And one sort of figure that brings this to light is, in the end, someone like Woodrow Wilson, because obviously, what he said during the war had a tremendous transnational impact. So it was listened to, used or instrumentalized or seized upon by all kinds of different actors, very powerful actors that had to deal with it. For example, the British and French governments that all of a sudden could not make peace by themselves anymore. They had to do it with this power that had never played such a role, the United States. But also, of course, all the kinds of actors, Indian nationalists, a young Mahatma Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, who were coming to Paris in 1919 thinking that maybe something really transformational is possible. Yet, if we looked more closely at what they thought, they were more realistic than a lot of the historians who've written about them. They knew that they were not on the verge of being on equal terms with the greatest empires in the world, but nonetheless, they were trying to widen their room to maneuver. So we have to understand all of them, but I suggest we also have to understand that there is a new kind of way of understanding international power and influence, and the question of who really shaped the outline and the architecture of the peace, the ground rules of this new order. And so we might conclude that it was wonderful that all of a sudden thousands of pamphlets of a perfected League of Nations ensued. But of course, 99.5% of these had no bearing on the final shape of the League of Nations as it was founded. And so we need to look at what I call a reformation of international hierarchies, in a new modern way. Hierarchies that have to do with a new kind of language of power, also to do with the suggestion that from now on new ground rules apply. For example, the idea that if you wanted to be a leading member or even just a card-carrying member of the League of Nations, you had to take steps towards democratic reform. You had to have credentials that before 1914 you did not have to have. And in many ways, this kind of new hierarchy is something that, of course, fundamentally characterized the peace of 1919 and its problems, as I would suggest. So the problem that there's a massive gap, even a chasm in part, between the expectations and conceptual sort of aspirations that Wilson and many others raised before this peace conference, and the outcome of this highly complex bargaining, negotiating process where all the actors had to learn to make some kind of compromises between their different agendas. At the end of which, however, the very act of doing this proved so complicated that when the victors had their first sort of preliminary peace sort of architecture, they almost felt it was impossible to negotiate this now with others, especially with the representatives of Weimar Germany, who were aspiring to a negotiated Wilsonian peace at the same time. Because they thought, if we try to do this, this will unravel and we might never get to a peace. This is one thing that this book tries to show, how far there was an opportunity to make a more inclusive, more sustainable peace, more legitimate peace that was also sort of acceptable, not just to the victors, which was hard enough, but also to the vanquished and many other sort of actors at this time. So why this was not achieved. But that also tries to suggest that we need to look not just at these systemic dimensions and processes, but also at something that comes back to maybe a very venerable and old tradition that goes back all the way to Thucydides. Namely, we need to look at the kind of ideas, imaginaries, assumptions on which the actors who are engaged in this process operated. And here I'm trying to show that in a striking way, we should get sort of rid of some of these old ideas that you had a progressive, pro-democratic Wilson and an American delegation engaged in a fight for a more egalitarian world order on the one hand, and the perfidious Europeans who were sort of ensnaring them into deals to keep their empires. What I'm trying to suggest is that they all operated on markedly hierarchical assumptions. And this is easier to show. I don't have the time for the British and the French actors, also the non-governmental actors, who, for example, thought that, to follow Lloyd George's wonderful claim late in 1918, that the British Empire was already a kind of League of Nations. It was a precursor, a slightly hierarchical League of Nations where the more advanced sort of motherland and other parts, the dominions, were of course very engaged in leading the less advanced towards a better future, while taking taking it upon themselves to control them and their resources for a little while longer. So these actors, Curzon and others, they had, of course, then thought, we can expand this kind of thinking to the Middle East. Oil became more relevant, and as you know, in the end, a compromise was made in which you didn't have sort of direct sort of expansion of these empires, but you had a mandate system which was basically functioning like a neo-imperial device under the heading of the League of Nations, where very surprisingly, Britain got a mandate over what is now Iraq, and France got a mandate over Lebanon and Syria. Yeah, so new language had to be used, but there are very strong hierarchical sort of assumptions, yeah, that are still at play. Yet they also apply to Woodrow Wilson and many American actors. And this is, I think, very important to point out because it had consequences. And most obviously, this of course applies to this, this gap between Wilson's promises. He adopting the language of self-determination, not at first speaking of self-government in the US tradition, but in response to Lenin speaking of self-determination by 1918, but then coming back to his earlier assumptions that there are some peoples and civilizations, and especially sort of male Protestant US ones and Anglo-American ones that of course are much more capable of having truly self-governing orders, and there are many others that require tutelage. So this is a classic way of thinking from the era of liberal imperialism that of course is very present in Wilson's sort of assumptions about the post-war order. So the League of Nations is a device to eventually, in an evolutionary way, lead towards a world of more egalitarian, sort of self-determined members of this league. But at first, it is a hierarchical organization. It is also one, and this is more important for the nature of this piece, in which these kinds of assumptions are also applied to the vanquished. So famously, Wilson, when he thought that he could no longer sort of persuade or compel France and Britain to accept some kind of inclusion of Weimar Germany into the original league, got sort of had the device of saying, we have to put them on probation. They have to show that they are committed to democracy and to fulfilling the peace terms, then later they might be included. And this, of course, had the impact of justifying what from a German, also liberal social democratic perspective, not just by young Hitler or by the Ludendorffs and nationalists, was seen as an imposed peace. This is something that someone like Max Weber criticized in 1919, and one of his, those who was influenced by him, a certain Carl Schmitt, later turned into a massive critique of Western style kind of double standards, where he said when the Americans and British talk about equality and universal values, they just want to extend their Monroe Doctrine or their lording it over others. So the peace had massive legitimacy problems for both systemic and procedural reasons, but also because of the underlying assumptions. Yet the book is also somewhat longer towards the end, because one of the points it's trying to make is that it is utterly unrealistic after not just a catastrophe like the First World War, but also the decades of its prehistory of this very unhinged international disorder of unlimited competition, to believe that at one sort of peace conference, you can basically settle the post-war issues, and what you then have to do, you enforce it. This is not what the main actors of 1919 thought. Wilson or Clemenceau, their advisors, and the more sort of sophisticated advocates of the League of Nations were thinking mainly about mechanisms and rules to start to embark on longer-term pacification processes and stabilization processes. So they thought of using, for example, the League to sort of stabilize Eastern Europe over time, of negotiating between different claims for territory, in between Poland and Germany, and so on. All these kinds of questions. So the old view of either measuring the sort of Peace of Versailles as a failed peace or as a wonderful peace or the best possible peace is just too narrow an interpretation, in my view. Thus, the final part of the book links up with what is sort of the first part of this trilogy that I'm trying to write, namely the 1920s and what was done after Versailles and before the Great Depression, to try to reform the originally very limited peace and order that actually came out of the Paris Peace Conference. This will take us to agreements such as the Locarno Security Pact and the other agreements of the 1920s that actually led to something like a more limited Euro-Atlantic order. Yet finally, and this is sort of my final outlook, so the whole dynamic of this project is that I think what we really have to deal with is a more long-term process that basically challenges the idea that in the 20th century there was something like a 30 years war. So a 30 years war where you have a starting point around 1914 and then conflicts and actors and Germany in the middle, of an almost inexorable sort of drive towards a Second World War, and only then some kind of more fundamental change. I would contend that we should talk about a post-First World War order and period, not an interwar period, because this is, again, using thinking of the 1930s and 40s to reflect on the period that went before it. But more fundamentally, we should think of what I call a 60-year sort of dialectical process of starts and attempts and backlashes and greater crisis and greater challenges, eventually then leading us to the to the ideas that surrounded the Yalta and Potsdam attempts to create a post-war order after 1945, and then on very different terms, in my view, not linear and nicely sort of progressive learning processes, but fundamental learning processes that by the late 1940s, and the period between 1947 and basically the early 1960s, led to some major systemic advances in terms of building something like a Euro-Atlantic peace system. So this will take us to the period of a new interpretation of what the NATO alliance was all about, the significance of the Marshall Plan and the European Recovery Program. And one of my basic sort of interventions is to say, yes, of course, the Cold War dynamics and the conflict with the Soviet Union played an important part in making these advances or changes possible, but we should not overemphasize this, because they were what was done was undertaken by actors like George F. Kennan, Jean Monnet, many others, who had lived through this longer period, not of incessant crisis and war, but of hopeful beginnings, problems in the 1920s, the experiences of the 1930s that led many, like Kennan, to be very skeptical about the prospect even of the United States surviving as a democratic state, or and so on. And then finally towards what I consider attempts to really do something fundamentally different. For example, from a US perspective, this time to make long-term commitments, not just to the UN on a global scale, but to something like a Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And to think of something that in 1916-17 only some intellectuals like Walter Lippmann had thought of earlier, something like an Atlantic community. So the idea that you have sort of some common endeavor that could no longer be just US or European. And so this is something I hope to show in all its limitations, but also in its impact in the next and final, I think, volume of this project. At the same time, and I think this is the other part that I would want to stress at the end, this is an attempt to place Atlantic and Euro-Atlantic international history in a global context. So this book is written in a global context, in a global frame of reference, but I unfortunately cannot emulate scholars like Jürgen Osterhammel or Arnie Westad, who then can also incorporate Chinese sources and Korean and others. I lack a lot of these language and other sort of capabilities to do that. But I still think what one can do is to develop a conceptual and intellectual framework that does not suggest that we can somehow compartmentalize the Euro-Atlantic world and the rest of the world. We have to look at the interactions between the two. And one of the most interesting, I think, questions that arises here is why for European, but also especially American actors like Woodrow Wilson, there are such discrepancies in their attitudes towards, on the one hand, Europeans, people he thought of as more or less not quite being on the level of his kind of advancedness as a Protestant US American, but that he did not think of as completely being hierarchically at a lower sort of level. And his attitudes towards the rest of the world. And this we can sort of draw out, extrapolate, if we try to explain why it was that especially US actors pursued such different policies towards East Asia, towards Latin America, towards other parts of the world, if we compare that with the kinds of structures that they built up with especially Western European allies, where I would not suggest that this was an egalitarian endeavor, but where, coming back to the formulation that I find very helpful here from Paul W. Schroeder, a masterful historian who's written about the transformation of the Vienna sort of international order, would call a behavior of a first among equals, that really allows some kind of consultation and cooperation with others and is not imposing its kind of terms and its kind of order on others. That's why the final book has the working title Pax Atlantica. It's not a Pax Americana. This is something I find that's something that needs to be challenged. So the final comment here is basically that we have a superabundance of books about empire, new forms of empire, Cold War empire, super empire, and so on. And this sells. But what I'm interested in is the kind of international order you build when you get beyond forms of empire, and what it takes to have an international system of ground rules between states that, of course, have differences in power and influence in the world, but that agree on certain basic constraints and sets of rules that would make impossible the kind of war we see in Ukraine right now, but also that would, of course, should make impossible the kinds of interventions that we've seen in Iraq and other US endeavors. So this is not it's not a partisan book or a blame game book. It tries to raise this question in the most comprehensive possible way. All of this to say, that's why it had to be a somewhat longer book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a terrifically kind of rich and capacious introduction. And part of me is tempted to want to take the conversation straight to Ukraine, because I think that's where we're going to go at some point. But I don't want to do that right away. So what I want to do, and this may seem a little perverse after you've given us such a broad view of your thinking, but I want to push you to go even bigger and reflect with us on how you see the history of international order as unfolding over the past half millennium. Now, we often
only the last half millennium. Really. That is far too narrow conception in my book.
And I know that you're deeply read in antiquity, but we could go there. But what I'm interested in is the modern era, which is conventionally narrated, right, as a series of equilibria, which we call phases of international order, that are punctuated by great crises, what political scientists call systemic wars, which are followed by moments of recasting or reordering. And these are canonical moments: 1648, 1713, 1815, 1919, and 1945. And in this room, I don't even have to spell out what those moments signify, because they're sort of universal reference points in the evolution of international order. Now, it seems to me, Patrick, that you take a different view. You seem to be presenting a sort of historical sensibility in which international order results not from moments of creation, these singular events, post-war conferences in which the great powers sit down and hammer out the terms of the new order. You're describing something not like a sort of process of constitution making, but a slower, much more incremental and more organic sort of process of becoming, a process that can unfold over decades. And it seems to me that we might, if we were to sort of borrow a metaphor from evolutionary biology, that we might characterize what you're doing as presenting a sort of classically Darwinist conception of international order's evolution, as contrasted to the more sort of Gouldian view of international order as a series of punctuated
Yes.
Equilibria
Mm-hmm.
that prevails in the historiography. And is that a fair characterization of your outlook? And
why not start with a small question? So yes, no, I think my first instinct would say don't take it too far, because what I'm trying to show in this book is that you need to do both. So if I were Tolstoy, I would say you need to look at war and peace, but of course you cannot discount the transformative and shifting and system shattering quality of these big crises. So you can have in this book you can write a history where by the end, what I consider the end of the pre-war period, which I consider the formative first third of the long 20th century, you have a lot of thousands of very well-educated international lawyers, social reformers, especially on both sides of the Atlantic, but also in Japan and other places, that say we already know what a modern order should really look like, and we've tried to make this clear in the making of the Hague Conventions. We have many peace congresses. We are trying to educate the populations. We need to, if we want democracy, we have to have better educated citizens. And over time, this will sort of eradicate the kinds of despotisms and problems in the Wilhelminian structure and wherever you go. And this can then be done first at the top of this hierarchy, and this can trickle down in the world. And we don't need any kind of major crisis. This takes one particular form in the era of Theodore Roosevelt and Joseph Chamberlain, where you have this basic idea that you could have something like a policing system where the most advanced, the most civilized, self-styled policing powers like Britain, the British world system, and the United States take the lead. They were considering taking Wilhelmine Germany into this, but it's basically an imperial kind of way of ordering things. And this is completely shattered, not evolutionarily and nicely, but by a war that blows up these kinds of calculations. Nonetheless, I would argue, if we write this history from the July 1914, we miss out on the kind of fundamental problems that also had to be addressed after the end of the war. So there's a longer pre-war. And this I would sort of take back through history. And in this book, there are many references to, indeed, Thucydides and classic times, and what works like Christian Myers on ancient Athens have shown how in the Athenian messy, newly democratic, not so democratic kind of ordering, many sort of false starts were made and problematic decisions were made, and Athenian hegemony that Pericles was extolling as sort of the greatest ever went down in flames. So these problems. So a former colleague of mine, Kagan, and would have a very different take on this, what it means for the modern era. I think that there is something systemic in terms of reaction to crisis, very classic terms, hubris, complacency, ideas of being so special that you don't have to negotiate, that you simply, and this is something Wilson tried when he arrived in Europe in late 1918, thinking, I have so much sort of what we might call today soft power and charisma, and I can basically constrain almost everybody else to follow my lead towards the League. He had to learn the very hard way that this could not be done at all, that this crumbled. So I would say, in your sort of come back to your question, we need to understand both these longer term, more evolutionary changes and the impact of crises and really tectonic shifts. And my problem with these moments is that usually they don't explain very well why there was such a moment. So because if you only focus on the moment, you cannot do that. And so the best work, I mentioned Paul Schroeder's, it shows you both what happened before the French Revolution, but then also shows what happened after Napoleon was trying to reorder Europe in his very own way. And similarly, works like Peter Wilson's on the 30 Years' War, you have to understand that to understand what happened in 1648. And I think this is, again, this calls for this takes more, let's say, determination and will to say, I'm not going to go for the quick book on something that is very challenging nowadays. If you want to be global and long-term, this goes, there's two big corridors that you have to address. And I think one of the tendencies we've seen in recent years is to go for the kind of, let's do that globally, but in a moment. And this leads to skewed sort of perspectives, unless someone's willing at least to think intellectually through why we ever got to that moment. So in that sense, I think there is, so it's a systemic, sort of comprehensive history that considers both the long-term and the cathartic crisis.
So I don't want to push you to contrast your approach to approaches that other historians have taken, but would it be fair to say that you would sort of argue against the proposition that we should see, say, 1928 as a moment of singular transformation or remaking?
I think you already answered the question, yes. But because it's precisely in my first book, I deal with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and it is a very interesting moment where aspirations come together. That wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if, without war and major crisis, we just agreed that we outlaw war?
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, in the year after that and the crisis, there were certain actors who just did not accept this very well. So if you think that this is a glorious moment, then it was a very ephemeral moment that, in my view, we might link more gainfully with sort of people who come back to this after 1945 and say this aspiration is very kind of something that we should pursue, but we need completely different structures, enforcement mechanisms, and something like a sustainable United Nations or a legal court that is not just sort of passing decrees, but that actually has a political impact because others accept it. And this, of course, is a much broader agenda. I don't criticize. So the point here is it is very valuable to see how people thought at the time, and to put on the agenda that, in my view, they had very unrealistic expectations of what this could do. But we should not make the mistake of taking their assumptions for what actually we say in retrospect could be done at that point. So.
Absolutely. Let me just speak to the room and invite others. If you want to raise a question, just raise a hand. I will introduce questioners or ask you to introduce yourselves. Zach.
Thank you. This is a really wonderful challenge of conventional thinking. Much needed. I don't know if this question will sound like I'm articulating an old school view, but if it does, okay, let's take it on. It seems to me that the victors, at least in World War I, want stability, as you've said, and are trying, and throughout the period you're discussing, there's a search for what will produce stability. And part of the problem seems to me that we're in a transition period in the modern era where mindsets are changing, as you've alluded to.
Yes.
And the states themselves are internally divided because not everyone's at the same point in their shifting mindset. You can see it, for example, in smaller incidents like the Ritzar massacre, where then you have the debates in 1920 in the House of Commons where some say, yes, kill all the Indians, that was the right thing to do, and others say this is terrible, we need to move toward greater civil democracy, and that's a larger reflection of a larger problem. Is there room in your analysis for the internal divisions and the role of these emotions that are undermining the search for stability, such as revenge, the way victors wanted stability, but they are also wanting revenge at the same time. These kinds of discordant desires are undermining this. Can you speak to that?
No, thank you for this question, because it gives me a chance to say absolutely. Part of what I'm trying to construct is a broad enough framework to encompass an understanding of what is modern international politics. And I'm not saying so. Let me start with Max Weber. So he famously, right after the First World War, comes out with this politics as vocation. There's this definition of modern politics, sort of drilling of thick planks with determination and passion. So there's emotion, there's an attitude, and there are these planks. And there's the idea that nothing is done quickly. You have to keep going. So what I'm trying to show in the introduction, and I hope in the book, is that everything is beginning to be transformed Yeah, the planks themselves, they are much more complicated and multi-layered. Yeah, transnational, international, domestic, discordant. Yeah, then the kind of drilling you have to do, which I consider, the politics of making agreements, of balancing different ideas, emotional capacities, one could even say, and legitimation requirements in different national or imperial sometimes contexts, with something that actors consider workable solutions. Yeah, so this is not a new requirement, but I would argue it's never been more complex than after the First World War, when everything was on the line, and you add to this the new range of expectations of what this political process was supposed to do. And if you then add, for example, the dimension that's supposed to be very transparent and open and not reliant on any old assumptions. Wilson famously said, we can learn nothing from the Congress of Vienna. This is just old-fashioned European hierarchical diplomacy that we have to transcend. Then you get a sense that what is required is a kind of a framework of reference on what is the political, which goes far beyond conventional ideas of the political. And for example, in 1918 encompass domestic legitimation requirements that have to do with moral ideas of who is supposed to pay for this war, not just in financial, but also in moral terms. Who caused it? What are the attitudes? And this I try to do by having first a long chapter on what I call the war within the war, namely the political and ideological war, in which before this peacemaking you had years of battles, of struggles, over who had the vision for the future and what was supposed to happen. And this is not a linear thing where everyone was gravitating towards Wilsonian ideas. No, on the contrary, hyper-imperialist ideas, if you think of the Brest-Litovsk agenda, that also used self-determination, but under an imperial umbrella, and so on. So the idea that, for example, Gustav Stresemann, when he was still, someone who was called Ludendorff's young man, and had these great conceptions of Greater Germany that had to be a modern empire ruling over Eurasia. Why? Because it had to keep up with the greatest such empires, the British and the world system, and the United States. So here again, you have this new, you have these different perspectives that have nothing to do with a nicely linear, kind of inexorable development, evolutionary development towards one kind of order. No, it's the struggle is the term. And this struggle also has to do with personal, if you think of some of the decision making that had most consequences in 1919, it's between some of the so-called top actors. And we have so many cliches about Clemenceau and nationalists or whatever. No, I try to present a nuanced view on all of them. So Clemenceau, for example, a different generation than Wilson, but much more sort of invested in a kind of realistic thinking that you needed time, to make a kind of peace that he thought viable between Germany and France. He was not someone who wanted Weimar Germany, to be ostracized forever, but he said, we first need to have security and we need to have Anglo-American guarantees to embark on this longer process. If we do this now, in 1919, then the Germans will just take advantage of us. Oh, what? So there are many different, and of course he had to address his home audience. So this book tries to show how these different sort of dimensions all are part then of one big process that you have to be very rigorous in trying to analyze. If you just suggest, oh, it was so, you often have that. Margaret Macmillan says, for example, Versailles is partly just an emotional and chaotic process. That's not enough, I think. And of course, she says much more than that, but there is this sort of, then you tell all these anecdotes of, and so on. So I'm trying to have a sort of compromise between the conceptual sort of framework and then agency. I'm very interested in agency. Who could actually act, determine, do something that actually changed the rules? And this doesn't mean that those were only always the state actors and the big men that were not so big. Very often you have people who change the playing field in ways that these actors cannot control. And these are, for example, associations, or these revolutionaries who all of a sudden have been elevated, I think, too far. So if you have this idea that it's Wilson versus Lenin, I find this fundamentally misleading, because they didn't have the same kind of power. And nonetheless, we have to analyze what is the impact of Lenin's ideological, sort of ingenious way of trying to contest everything that was done at the Paris Peace Conference. All of this requires this broad framework, which I call integrated international history, just in the sense of saying we shouldn't just go for one or the other. We should try to see the big picture.
Well, that's a point that leads very neatly into an audience question that I'd like to introduce. Jim Dingaman writes, "Thank you for the stimulating discussion. How are you processing the rise of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Islamism, and the stirrings of anti-colonialism in the pre-First World War and certainly the post-First World War period into your examination of global history?"
So I do process it. I don't do it on the same kind of level that a specialist historian who could actually read the different original sources on these actors could do on Africa, on different contexts. But it is very much part of this book, because if you think that, my argument is before the First World War, you have a kind of international disorder that has a lot of impact and consequences for especially those who are at the lower end of this food chain and who are trying to sort of maneuver in context where the European and the American sort of actors decide what their fate is supposed to do. Look at China before 1914, so and so on. So I'm trying to show how they thought about the future before 1914, and then to reflect on what, in their view, changed through the war. And they were, in my view, very often much more realistic, much more astute than some people who've written about them later, because they didn't think that it was a sort of cataclysmic moment where all of a sudden they could easily or soon gain independence, but they thought that they could widen their room to maneuver. And yet, of course, if you look at the kind of choreography of peacemaking and reordering in 1919, there are, so that there are kind of alternative. This is not original or new, but I incorporated. You have a Pan-African Peace Congress, you have a suffragette peace congress, you have other sort of parallel, more symbolic almost sort of endeavors to show these inner circle people that what they were doing was too narrow. But if you then try to reflect, and one can do that on the basis of sources, how much what they did had any influence on the inner decisions, on the mandate system, on the future of India and so on, then of course we get to this almost tragic chasm between some of the hopes they had and then the disappointments that ensued. But this is the beginning of a much longer process that very excellent historians have written about. It's the longer history of decolonization and of changes in the extra sort of Atlantic world. And one of the things I'm simply trying to do is to argue we should go again, avoid this compartmentalization. So there's not one set of things that's happening in this part of the world, and then we go to a different part of the world and different things apply. And the United States is a particularly interesting subject, both in terms of the different actors who are trying to have an impact here, and of course of its almost natural, sort of ever more global sort of patterns of interaction, not just with Europe, but with every part of the globe on sometimes very strikingly different terms. So that would be my claim. But ideally, I would love to write this book with having, then it would be a 2,000-page book, and with all the other languages and sort of things involved in it.
Well, there's more that I want to ask you on the peculiarities of the United States as a protagonist. But I wonder if I could sort of ask a question that may sort of invite you to elaborate for us sort of the first big analytical move that your book makes, but also to connect the argument that you make in the book to sort of the challenges that the world is confronting today in relation to Ukraine. We're into the last 25-minute stretch, so we can get Ukraine into the conversation. Look, it's perilous for historians, as you know, to look for parallels to the present in the past. but I think it's more perilous for the historian who's answering the question than it is for the historian who's asking the question. So I'm going to ask you.
Then you're in a good position.
You described the period between about 1880 and 1914 as a phase of regression or involution, when the international system experienced a sort of process of decomposition and became steadily more disordered, steadily less orderly. As you write in your book, I think, the crucial, and here I'm quoting directly from you, the crucial and erstwhile essentially integrated European concert system came to be supplanted by an inherently unstable and highly conflict-prone balance of power system. So my question is, what parallels, if any, do you see to the degradation of international order in the decades since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps especially in the years since the Iraq War and the financial crisis?
If I were really a brilliant historian, I would just say sleepwalking, but I will not do that. So it's not so straightforward in my view, because so many things precisely changed the very nature of the system, ideas people had about what to do in the international world because of all the crises and things that happened from this period through the long 20th century, at the end of which we find ourselves today. So nonetheless, I think there are certain, so I started by trying to say that these kinds of watershed periods, sort of can bring out two tendencies. A, they can lead to, they can make it obvious that certain understandings and certain ways of operating do no longer work and are shown to have been complacent, self-serving, or simply sort of manipulated in a way that served much narrower interests than was purported. And if you think of Western, German, US, other policies towards Putin's Russia, especially since 2014, where you instigate something like a Minsk process, it's violated almost the next day, but it's enough to keep you saying we are keeping a kind of diplomatic, Bismarck would have said, a diplomatic thread to Russia. And at the same time, you pursue all the kinds of partly corrupting, partly just very self-serving, and sometimes just very practical priorities, such as building gas pipelines and having all kinds of deals. Or if you look at London, inviting ever more, ever shadier Russian capital into your great realm of civilization. So these things are now, of course, under a glaring light of criticism that for years, until not so long ago, people have criticized them. I can name many. And in the same way that before 1914, you had a lot of very intelligent people who were saying, if we are not careful and we just fix the latest crisis, but don't do something more structural, at some point this will explode. But they were seen sometimes as, it's it was a very jolly speech at the Oxford Union again, and this was, wonderful, but then we move on, because there are so many interests in keeping things going, and so one of the examples is, it's a very complex field, but so part of why the British Empire entered into alignments and alliances was not to contain the German Empire, but to do sort of deals with their main competitors in the imperial sphere, Russia over Afghanistan, France in Africa, and eventually, so they had these new understandings, and then they turned them towards the sort of containment of Germany. But there are many such moves that are not subconscious, they're not sleepwalking moves. They're quite conscious moves, but they don't address the fundamental problems. And there's an easy way of then looking at what consequences this had, because we have Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, in 1914 saying, okay, there is a massive crisis in the Balkans and there are mobilizations, but we can act in accordance with the concert of Europe. So let's call the parties to London and find a way of dealing with these things. There was a slight problem with this. The concert had been completely hollowed out. They could still utter the phrase, but the mechanisms did no longer exist. And especially the mentalities did no longer exist. And that's what I'm trying to show. So actors, in a way, had unlearned what it took to preserve peace. So they were into this quick fix mode. And of course, they all subscribed, more or less, and I would argue, to this idea that, if you did not keep up in this race of civilizational Darwinists belonging to the top set of people in the powers in the world, you would fall behind. Yeah, Salisbury's dying nation speech, there are many instances of this. Yeah, and to do that, yeah, it did not pay to invest in system building, moderation, and all these kinds of things. And then we have the United States as a final point. So you have attempts by Theodore Roosevelt, who is a particular hero in this book, but not an entire shiny hero, who says the United States now should be a policing power and get educate the American public on that you need a stronger navy and so on. But if you think of the corollary to the Monroe Doctrines, of course, a blatant example of exactly this kind of idea that it's the United States that decides who is civilized and who's not civilized, and then intervenes in instances where, if you look at the Anti-Imperialist League in Boston, that shows very clearly that it's US American-induced corruption that's at the heart of the problem in Latin America, and not some civilizational defect. Yeah, so it's exactly this kind of thinking, nonetheless, that casts a light on the point this book is also trying to make. The United States as a society, and this is not a blaming, it's an analytical point, is absolutely not prepared for a world role, in many ways. And so Wilson is trying to quick start this in a very emphatic way, but all the kinds of things you need to do, building bipartisan support, having the American public sort of discuss and debate as a democracy of what you are supposed to do. These are beginning, these are processes that are beginning to take shape, but by 1919, this is still a very fragile, sort of endeavor. And nonetheless, it's a very formative one, because you have all these, very important actors, not just in Washington, but across the country, church unions, many others that begin to think of the United States more as a global actor. But we are at the beginning of this process, and that's exactly the kind of sort of beginning I then want to trace through the 20th century towards not a linear, wonderful outcome where all of a sudden everyone understands what's going on. But again, the operative term is struggle. It's a big power struggle between different, for example, in 1919, you have Wilson saying, what I'm doing is the true Americanism. We need to be more international. In my book, he is not an internationalist, he's an Americanist. Cabot Lodge says what Wilson is doing is today, and Trump would have said it's a communist endeavor or whatever. But Cabot Lodge said it's un-American. So it's using terms of a struggle that we've seen before, and it would be completely unrealistic, again, not to expect this, because so much is at stake. And one final point, this also concerns the nature of the modern state. So Wilson has very eloquent statements where he's saying, we don't want to become a European-like militarized state with a big standing strategic reserve, and that needs to raise a lot of taxes and funding, and centralizes power in Washington. We don't want that. So originally, as you know, he didn't want to intervene in the First World War. He wanted to be an independent, neutral arbiter. But he had to understand that this wouldn't have given the United States any power to convince those who had invested blood and tears and treasure into this war to make peace on American terms. Yet again, it's a long process that, if you think of the contrast between 1919 and the United States then, and then sort of think of the impact of the New Deal in the United States and globally, and then the kinds of debates around the Korean War, when we are talking all of a sudden of this massive revolution of American state power, we need to look at them in a broader context yet again. And so one final point, perhaps just on the Russia question. So this book is less, let's say, a book that can tell you when the crisis is escalating. So what do you need to do to make a quick fix? So you can also say, yes, send more weapons, do this and that. It's more trying to shine a light of how do we get to this kind of point? And I've written a little bit about this before. So this would take us to a reevaluation of the 1990s in particular. So the period when, after what my former colleague John Gaddis would say, the liberal victory in the Cold War. So what actually happened then? How far was then the post-Soviet Russia treated in a more sort of humiliating way, in a way that did not really do sufficiently sort of what the big task in 1919 was vis-a-vis Weimar Germany, namely to integrate the sort of the vanquished or the one that had lost the systemic struggle. And I think so this we can do. This is not a sort of debate, I think, to be had at length at a time when we need to sort of have a concrete set of policies, first of all, to get to a political process again. But I think it is very important because nowadays the short-termism of just moving on, and then let's let bygones be bygones, and eventually some historians might write about it, is so strong that I can tell you from the German example, a lot of actors in Berlin would love to have the sort of the sort of Kohl called it the kind of the cloak of history sort of being covering all the kinds of transgressions and little corruptions that were going on. Fortunately, this is unimaginable in Washington, but anyway, so I think it's the more long-term discussion that needs to be had.
I don't know if I drop into your 20th century timestamp, but I was told that Russia at one time requested to join NATO. In respect to what's happening in Ukraine, do you have any comments on that, or is this inappropriate?
Yeah, I'm certainly not the expert on that, but I think in the 1990s, various forms were negotiated of not just sort of thinking of enlarging NATO, but changing it, and this sort of to relate it to the kind of Helsinki OSCE structure. Gorbachev had spoken of a common European Euro-Atlantic house. So the idea that you turn a Western collective alliance more into the kind of mechanism that could securitize or secure a more broader order in which not just sort of, as Mary Sorotti has shown, sort of Western ideas were sort of taken and put in the East, but where actually all actors thought they were building something together. This was very difficult, of course, at a time, if you think back to the period of Yeltsin, where you did not have a lot of reliable policy leadership in Russia. So, but nonetheless, as a long-term strategy, I think it's very interesting to read what James Baker or the people of the first Bush administration were beginning to try to suggest, at a moment when the United States was at this, some people even, I forget who it was, thought of the end of history. Now people think of the return of history. For me, somehow history was around all the time. I can't help thinking. So nonetheless, so the idea that I think the word is complacency, because if you didn't need to do this, if the consequences were for a long time not so apparent, you went for the easier way. And this is also a very democratic problem because it takes a lot of capital, political capital, to say we now have to do something beyond. We have to think even bigger, and we might have to question ourselves. And look at from a European perspective. If you think about what happened after the September the 11th and the kinds of choices that were made in the United States and the kinds of interventions that were undertaken, the price in legitimacy this had, the price in treasure, what you could have done with all of this in a more in a more system building way, that's the question I would want to ask. And of course it's too, we have to draw lessons from that, I think.
John, thank you for your talk. We're moving into close to the present, but you did mention NATO during your talk, and you're moving toward an analysis, I guess, of the emergence of NATO after the war, which I imagine, given what you said, will take NATO out of its immediate Cold War context and things like the Berlin crisis and the like, and the Korean War, which are immediately important for explaining that.
Yes.
To a longer term perspective, and in that spirit, I'd like to take the conversation to the 1990s when it turned out that NATO, although in the Bush, Mary Sorotti writes in the Bush administration, there was some discussion about another security architecture.
Yes.
It was never really adopted, and then there were, of course, in the Clinton administration, there were those who were in favor of NATO expansion for various reasons of many kinds. But then in the actual crises that took place in Europe, in the Balkans, so Bosnia, Kosovo, turned out that only NATO could respond. Right, and so in a sense, NATO made an argument for itself, and in that sense, we're thinking of blame game these days, and we're taking the arguments back to the 1990s. The Russian interlocutors were, of course, part of the so-called Balkan contact group, right? Absolutely against intervention in Kosovo. And the American view and the Western view was that is not an option after the genocide of Bosnia. And if you put all these cards on the table, then it's difficult really to reimagine the 90s in the way that you've just suggested we might do.
Well, I would still maintain that one has to, because it's part of this wider struggle. Yeah, so exactly to show why some of these choices and why NATO stayed relevant. Yeah, so for example, involve an argument that we can take back to 1919. In 1919, it's the French strategist, especially André Tardieu and others, Peter Jackson has shown this in this very important book. They conceptualize something like NATO. Yeah, they call it an Atlantic security community. Yeah, that should police Europe to the civilizational frontier, and that is not the Dnieper but the Rhine. Yeah, because Germany is on the other side. Yeah, so it's an imaginary that's quite different, but they are trying. Yeah, so they write all these concepts that lay the foundation for something that then Bevin and others were trying to take on when European attempts to found a security system after the Second World War showed their limitations. Yeah? So in 1919, Wilson and his advisors thought that this was completely unpalatable because it was against the spirit of the League of Nations. The United States would not be involved in alliances and more. And so in the end, they negotiated this guarantee agreement. But nonetheless, the core question: what kind of inner structure do you have, and what are the alternatives? Yeah. So this is a guiding question throughout the 20th century. And so if we take it to the 1990s and beyond, part of this is exactly as you suggest. So if the Europeans think that they want a more emancipated European part in this, or their own system, if you think of Macron nowadays, and you look at the gap between their pronouncements and the kind of institutional or other steps they've taken to do this in any way, especially if you look at Germany, which there's a gigantic gap. And as long as you do that and then blame the Americans if someone uses too much military power, that's an unsustainable position. But again, this one has to understand in the longer term, and so I think it's very interesting then to think, so who thought why? I think it's some of the hardest constellation is, if something basically works, why do you want to regroup it and reorganize it, with the risk that whatever you replace it with is actually
like
working?
The German Constitution in 1990. Do you recall?
In 1919.
1990.
Oh, 1990.
So
Yeah, of course.
The idea was the German federal constitution works. Why should we reinvent it?
And this has had many legitimacy consequences that now become more apparent. The kind of humiliation East Germans feel as having been the kind of it's a bit like the South in the American Civil War, I would say, in the longer term. That you feel that others make the terms. And this book at the very outset, as you referred to a little bit, it tries to suggest a durable order can only be one that's legitimate, and what does make it legitimate has many parts, but part of it is the process. So is there an agency? Are people actually involved in setting terms, or is someone imposing or otherwise compelling others to accept terms? And I think this we can see on the national level and on the local level, but this also applies in the international sphere. And this is something, of course, it can be instrumentalized to no end. So if you read Hitler's speeches or Putin's claims, you can go far too far with this. But the problem is you create a kind of legitimacy sort of problem, that actors like that can use if you obviously suggest one thing like an inclusive peace process, and then you proceed to do something different. And this was one of the most sort of shattering problems in 1919.
I think we've got time for one more question.
From your experience with the history of international orders, would you say there's a possible future where the People's Republic of China is a part of a functioning international order, or are the differences just insurmountable? Maybe following Henry Bull, who said that you need a certain cultural common basis to form an international society.
I think it's a tough question, but I once was at a Yale sort of internal conference on world order, where you had almost a kind of meeting of essentialists of different kinds. So they were, so there was Kissinger, who was not among them, but many others, and I won't name names, but were basically remapping the world and saying of all the kinds of the actors who will never be part of a functioning world order. And if you go with the sort of what they said about Russia, of course, right now we're in a situation where it's a long-term process, and about China, then the kind of world you construct is one of basically enduring containment, because this takes us back to 1919. It's one where only very few can actually be in the club, and the rest have to be managed, deterred, and so on. And I have no sort of naive, I think one has to understand systems of power. So if you want to understand how far you can have realistic perspective for China, then you have to understand, so what are the chances that it's in the logic of those who might at some point succeed Xi Jinping and his kind of system to play it differently, and what are the logics? So we might, for a long time, people said it's just interdependence and the mutual interest in being part in economic and other terms of a world where you don't sort of shield yourself off. And I think these kinds of nice certainties have to be questioned. So you have to be in for the long haul. But I do believe that while I think the initiative Yale once had to sort of have a sort of presence in China to civilize the Chinese, if I may say so, that was a bit of a not the most sustainable attempt, but the general idea that if you think back to Tiananmen, if you think back to all the Chinese students I've had to deal with, then I would not think that, oh my God, because they are from this cultural context, I never could actually have a conversation with them where they had a sense of what was legitimate. They were just these different creatures. And in 1919, in this chapter, I think it's chapter 7, in this ideological war within the war, you wouldn't, it's not surprising, but you can find these kinds of claims about almost everyone. The Western civilization against German culture, and Thomas Mann weighing in, and so on. So these are, it's part of the political. So in that sense, it's not an easier sort of road, but I would definitely say if you start by centralizing and basically ruling out such development, you set yourself, this might be a realistic position for a certain period, and I would argue in favor of it vis-a-vis Putin. But in the longer run, we need to conceptualize a sort of a structure with Russia and also with China. How do you want to reform the United Nations and anything like a global regime of some kind, if you want that, with having them constantly in the role of the pariahs that need to be policed? So that would be my attempt at an answer.
I'm just going to comment on your response, Patrick, and say that sitting down in a seminar room with a bunch of dignitaries and presuming to remap the international order, that is such a Yale thing to do.
Indeed. But maybe even Yale can learn. That is, of course, a very problematic proposition.
But let me draw this to an appropriate conclusion by thanking Patrick profusely for like an incredibly broad-ranging and enlightening tour, really, of the historical origins and evolution of international ordering. Making international order is among the most difficult and challenging political tasks in which human societies have ever engaged. And I think, Patrick, what you've shown to us is that the making of international order, like all of the most awesome and challenging political tasks that we confront, will be better done to the degree that it is informed by a deep understanding of the history, which is what you're bringing. And for that, we should all be truly grateful. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Great. No.
I got lots more questions
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the US, but I want to say